Hello, this lecture is on emotions in the brain. So, we all know what emotions are, right? We feel them in the daily situations, very often, and we express them in various ways. So, suppose you are happy, that you smile a lot and you wave at people, or if you are sad or even grieving, you probably you shed tears or you weep, right? Or if you are angry, you might shake your fist and bang on the table and scream and so on and so forth. So, emotions, and there is a feeling that goes with emotions, and there is also an outward expression in the form of body language or facial expressions, and which is a good thing. It is a convenient thing, especially when in social interactions, because you know what the other person is feeling based on the emotional expression, right. And suppose you want to go meet your boss and ask for a pay rise, and if you can't read the meaning of that frown on your boss's face with the eyebrows like going at an angle, then you will be in trouble. Your request will be turned down, and or there can be a negative reaction. So, but thing is, the emotions that we in ordinary people like you and me feel in our day to day life are there could be a wide range of them, but it is very hard to define them very clearly, because there is something vague and inexpressible about emotions, right. And also in emotional expression, ordinary people may not be able to distinguish and produce very fine shades of emotion in terms of facial expression. So, for example, it may not be very easy for somebody who is not trained to show the difference between jealousy or resentment or gloating, right. It requires a very some kind of a training to express those kinds of emotions, which is what actors do, right. If an actor cannot show difference between jealousy and resentment, right, or sadness, then he would not be in business for too long, right. So, therefore, it is not enough just to have a vague idea of what emotions are, right. You need to make a science out of them. You need to have a complete list of all possible emotions, and you should have a clear understanding of how to express them, right, in facial expressions and body language. So, in arts, theatre and acting, you have to have a clear understanding of the science of emotions. In philosophy also, people have speculated, philosophers have speculated about everything under the sun. So, they have written a lot about emotions, the nature of emotions and things like that. Right. Here again there is a metaphysical, intellectual philosophies and also religious philosophies also have talked about emotions, especially in religious philosophies. They talk about what are the kind of emotions that take you to the goal of religion, which is right, reaching God or something like that, right. And what are the kind of emotions which take you away from that, and what are bad emotions, good emotions and things like that. In psychology, psychologists also are concerned with emotions, because there are some emotions which are normally a person is supposed to have right, a healthy emotional condition, right, which is necessary to live your life. So, what are the kinds of emotions which are healthy and positive, what are the kinds of emotions which are negative and harmful for your health, right. You need to have an understanding of that. So, psychology studies emotions as a science. Then emotions, very often there are two sides to emotion. There is a subjective side where there is just a feeling of emotion, and then there is an objective side where it is expressed in behavior, right. So, you want to understand the relationship between the inner feeling and the external behavior. So, you can study emotions from behavioral point of view also. In addition, since this course is basically about neuroscience, it is not about psychology, it is not about philosophy. So, what are the neural or cerebral underpinnings of emotion? So, exactly what happens in the brain when you are happy or when you are sad, what happens in the brain, how does which parts of the brain are active or participate in a certain emotion. So, those are some things that neurobiologists talk about. So, basically emotions or a science of emotions can be approached from different points of view, right, philosophy and arts, psychology, behavior and finally neuroscience. So, in this lecture we will talk about all these four components of the science of emotion. Let us begin with philosophy. Right, how are emotions discussed in philosophy? So, let us begin with Indian philosophy, and in Indian spiritual tradition there is a lot has been said about emotions, particularly let us start with Bhagavad Gita. Right, in Bhagavad Gita it mentions 6 emotions which it describes in kind of negative terms. It calls them the 6 inner enemies, right. The Arishad Varga, Ari is enemy and Shad is 6 and Varga is a class or a type. These are the 6 types of inner enemies. Right, these are desire or kama, anger or krodha, greed or lobha, right, delusion or moha, pride or mada, right, and jealousy matsarya. So, Gita says warns the seeker, right, of perfection against these inner enemies, and it urges the individual to identify these emotions and try to rise above them, to transcend them and reach a certain state of tranquility. So, that is the typical undercurrent that you see in Gita. Now, also in Patanjali Yoga Sutras, right, emotions have been mentioned and described. So, two major emotions, the two polar emotions, the raga, which is love, and dvesha, hate, right, your attraction towards something, or your revulsion towards something, are called kleshas or afflictions of mind. So, basically the Yoga Sutras say that they are bad for you, right, stay away from both. Okay, both. So, normally people think love is good and hate is bad, but right, Yoga Sutras say both are emotions, both bind you to objects of either love or hate. So, rise above them, because they are afflictions of the mind. Now, emotions are, so emotions, if you look at in religious philosophies, there is a kind of a note of negativity about them, because typically in Indian philosophy, Indian spiritual philosophies, emotions are considered as something negative and something that have to be transcended. Okay, whereas you cannot afford to do that in aesthetics, right, or in drama and dance and these different kinds of art forms. You cannot afford to put down emotions or look down upon emotions. You have to give them their rightful place and in the scheme of things, and be able to deal with them properly in a scientific fashion. So, if you look at Indian aesthetics, right, in Natya Shastra, which is the science of dance, this is based on a book written by the sage Bharata, right, it talks about 8 primary rasas. Rasas in common parlance is translated as soup, but here rasa means essence, or it is a essence of experience. When you sublimate experience, what do you have? What are the basic elements or essences of experience? So, Natya Shastra talks about 8 primary rasas. These are love or shringaram, humor or mirth, that is hasyam, fury or raudram, compassion or karunyam, disgust or bibhatsam, then horror or bhayanakam, valor veeram, and wonder adbhutam. At a later point, somewhere around 8th century, another emotion has been added to this list of 8 rasas, that is shantam or peace. And then subsequently 2 more have been added. These are vatsalyam, which is a kind of a love or a solicitude that a senior person, like a teacher, has towards a junior, like a like a disciple or a student. And then bhakti, which is the same love which is directed towards God. Okay, so we have a list of 11 emotions that in Indian aesthetics. So, this picture shows how different emotions according to Natya Shastra, particularly this is from the tradition of Bharatanatyam, right. How can these emotions be enacted in dance forms? So, Indian theory of rasas has another interesting side to it. It associates these rasas with a deity or a god, right, and also a color. Okay, so, associating emotion with a deity is interesting as an aspect of art, but it is kind of off limits for a science like neuroscience. But association of emotion with color is very interesting, because a lot of Western science, the Western treatment of emotions also represents emotions on some kind of a palette of colors, right, which is very convenient way of representing the internal relationships, the interrelationships among various emotions. So, we will come to that later. So, in Indian theory of rasas, the shringaram is associated with the god Vishnu, right, and with the color light green, and the hasyam or mirth or comedy is associated with a god named Pramata, right, whose color is white, and raudram, right, the presiding deity is Rudra, right. In fact, the word raudram comes from the word Rudra, and the color is red, right, and so on and so forth. So, it is very interesting that the emotions are associated with gods and also different colors. So, there is a lot has been written on emotions even in the Western tradition. For example, Aristotle, who has written a lot about various aspects of science extensively, has also given kind of a list of emotions. He named a lot of emotions, like for example, anger, mildness, right, love, enmity, fear, confidence, shame, and its opposite, shamelessness, benevolence, pity, indignation, envy, emulation, and contempt. Okay, so, you can see that different authors have at various epochs in time have proposed different lists of emotions, and there is a little problem with that, because there is nothing standard about these kinds of lists of emotions. Spinoza, who is a Dutch philosopher of 17th century, has stated, he has emphasized the role of cognition in emotions. In fact, this is a question that we will come to, we will return to again and again in this talk. Right, but the problem is different authors have given different lists of emotions, but there is nothing like a universal list of emotions. Okay, a lot of these lists are based on subjective speculation, so they do not have the kind of a strength of universality. Now, emotion and facial expression. So, a lot of study on emotions, right, has depended on facial expression, because in philosophy people depend on their introspection and subjective analysis and things like that, which cannot be considered as proper methods of science, because science depends upon objective measures, objective measurement. So, if you just give a list of emotions because you feel them that way, you feel they are universal, then that is not really science. So, if you give a list of emotions, you should map them on to something objective, something you can measure and see. So, one way you can measure emotions, since you cannot really understand what the other person is feeling, the only thing that you can understand or measure is what other person is showing, right, in the form of facial expressions. So, people have tried to classify facial expressions and map them onto emotions, and a lot of work has been done on these lines, and earliest work of this kind has been done by Charles Darwin, who is also the theorist of the theory of evolution. Darwin noticed that it's that emotions are expressed in facial expressions, and a lot of the facial expressions are universal, and they are not only universal among humans, right, certain facial expressions are shared between animals and humans. Okay, so look at this example right now. Here is a snarl that is seen in a human and an animal, and you can see that baring of the canines and lifting of the ends of the upper lip and so on and so forth, the kind of skewing of the eyebrows, right. You can see the parallels between this kind of an expression in man and animal. So, what Darwin says about this kind of a mapping is that the movements of expression in face and body, whatever their origin may have been, are in themselves of much importance for our welfare. They serve as the first means of communication between the mother and infant, because of the facial expression, right, or bodily expression of emotion, you can convey your emotion to somebody else, that will facilitate social interaction. So, therefore, they serve as the first means of communication between the mother and her infant. She smiles approval and thus encourages her child on the right path, or frowns disapproval. We readily perceive sympathy in others by their expression. The movements of expression give vividness and energy to our spoken words, right. They reveal the thoughts and intentions of others more truly than do words which may be falsified, because what you are saying is accompanied by movements of the hand or movements of your facial expression, then it has more vividness, it has more impact on the listener than just uttering the words without any emotion in them, without any warmth or color in them. Okay, so with this as starting point, that is the idea that facial expressions reveal emotions, a lot of workers have worked on that and tried to give classification of emotions. So, Sylvan Tompkins presented one such classification. He proposed the concept of an affect. So, emotion has, as we already mentioned, has two sides to it. There is the outward expression of emotion, and then there is the inner feeling. So, inner feeling is something that is known subjectively only to the person, the subject, right. So, you cannot really build a science around that, but the outward expression, right, or the biological side of expression, right, that is what is defined as affect in Sylvan Tompkins. In fact, there is a whole field of neuroscience called affective neuroscience, which deals with emotions as they are expressed in the nervous system. Okay, so, the affect is defined by Sylvan Tompkins as a biological portion of emotion. Okay, it refers to hardwired, pre-programmed, genetically transmitted mechanisms that exist in each of us, which when triggered precipitate a known pattern of biological events. So, he is talking about the neural underlying machinery of emotion expression and emotion generation. So, based on his analysis of facial expressions, he gave a list of emotions, and these are surprise, joy, interest, fear, rage, disgust, shame and anguish. And he further classified his emotions into neutral, positive and negative. So, surprise apparently according to him is a neutral emotion, and joy, interest are positive emotions, and fear, rage and others are negative emotions. So, Paul Ekman also has studied facial expressions and gave a classification of emotions, and the list that he has proposed consists of surprise, happiness, anger, fear, disgust and sadness. So, the thing is, some of these previous classifications, these lists of emotions, right, they do not really tell you how those emotions are related to each other. Okay, so, for example, love and hate are opposite emotions, but if you give a list of these things, you do not know that they are opposite. So, similarly, amazement and astonishment, right, are shades of the same thing, different intensities of the same thing. If you just give them as a list, you will not understand the interrelationships. So, similarly people have found that to express the relationship in terms of positive and negative or opponency between emotions, and also the different shades of intensity of the same thing, people felt it is convenient to describe emotions in terms of color, right. And it is interesting that in Indian theory of aesthetics, people have also have associated emotions with color, but that mapping is totally different from the kind of mapping that you are seeing here on this slide. This map of colors of emotion was proposed by Robert Plutchik, and he used to look at actually a very simple map here, and this has been further elaborated in more complex color maps that Plutchik had proposed. So, in this picture you can see that joy and sadness, right, joy is in the red side, red, and sadness is in kind of purple, they are in the opposite side. So, that indicates that joy is opposite of sadness. Then acceptance and disgust, you accept is, you are attracted towards it, you welcome it, and then disgust you kind of push something away. So, they are also opposite. Then fear and anger are, I do not know, it is not very clear why they are opposite, but so fear is you want to run away from something, right. In anger you want to act on something and harm something, okay. So, in that sense probably they are opposite. Then surprise and anticipation. So, if you are expecting something, that is anticipation, and you are not expecting something, you suddenly springs upon you and in a surprise, and that is surprise. So, you can see how in this very simple palette of colors different emotions are placed with respect to their interrelationships. Further on the circumference you see these other terms like submission and awe and disappointment, which indicate combinations of emotions. Like for example, at the top you have love, and love is, according to this picture, is a combination of joy and acceptance, because joyful acceptance of something is something that you feel as love, and submission is acceptance and fear, and acceptance but without joy, right, with fear, right, is submission or surrender, and awe is fear with surprise, and disgust and remorse is disgust with sadness, so and so on and so forth. So, you can see how he is trying to build some kind of an algebra of emotions, where emotions are expressed as colors. So, Plutchik also published more complex color charts like this, and these are like wheels of color, where you can distinguish between the primary colors and the derivatives and shades of emotions in terms of the different intensities. So, for example, here in this green petal going kind of to the northeast, right, you have admiration and then trust and acceptance, okay, or the green petal going eastwards, you have terror, right, and fear and apprehension. So, terror is a very intense form of fear, and fear is slightly more intense form of apprehension, okay. So, you can see the shades of intensity of different emotions. Similarly, on the left side going westwards, you have rage, okay, which is the most intense form of of anger, and then there is annoyance, which is a weaker form of anger, and so on, okay. So, it is very interesting that it indicates the opposite opponencies among emotions, the shades of difference among emotions also. So, for example, here the upward petal going northwards has ecstasy and joy and serenity, and on the opposite side you have grief and sadness and pensiveness, okay. So, you can see how this kind of a color chart very nicely places the emotions in terms of their interrelationships. But what is the connection between color and emotion? Actually, colors also seem to have a very similar internal structure, right. As we know that if you combine R, G and B, red, green and blue, you get white. Now, that means R plus G is equal to W minus B, and you get yellow, okay, which is what you can see in this color chart. So, in the center you see a white patch of light, and that is where the blue R, G and B meet, right, and then you have other sectors where only two colors meet. So, in this part, right, you can see, so this is magenta, okay, where you have blue and red meeting. So, R and B combine to form magenta, and that is equal to green getting removed from white. So, similarly, red and green when they meet, you get yellow, okay, that is like removing blue from white. Similarly, green and blue when they meet gives you cyan, and that is like removing red from white, and you see all these different relationships among primary colors and derivative colors, right, and their complementary colors in this color chart. Okay, so, like that, starting from the facial expression, people have given various classifications of emotion, right, but that is still quite superficial, because it only talks about how emotions are seen in facial expression. Let us go deeper and look at some of the prevailing theories, some of the dominant theories of emotions in psychology. Okay, so previously I have only looked at facial expression, but actually emotion is felt all over the body, right, because when you are angry, you are not just frowning or just pursing your lips and things like that. You are probably shaking in anger, and you are shaking your fist and banging on table, and in addition to the outward movements of the body, you also feel certain inner movements and responses in the body. Like for example, your heart rate might increase, your BP might increase temporarily, right, and so on and so forth. So emotion is something, and that is what is very special about emotion, right. It is its effects are seen all over the body. So therefore, if you want to understand emotion, you cannot stop at facial expression. You have to go deeper and look at its kind of an all body response. Now, so one of the first theories that talked about this bodily response of emotion, or the relevance of the bodily response to the emotional experience, right. It was such a theory was proposed by William James, who was an American psychologist who worked in the towards the end of the 19th century. So his work starts off with a simple question: do we run from a bear because we are afraid, or are we afraid because we run? Okay, so the normal common sense understanding of how emotion works is that, let us say you see a bear and you are scared. So your first cause of it is the appearance of the bear or the stimulus. In response to that, you first get scared, and then that fear makes you run away from the stimulus. So the normal sequence is stimulus, then the feeling or of emotion, and then response. But William James turns the table around and gives a totally different sequence. Let us see what he is saying. My thesis or my hypothesis is that the bodily changes follow directly from the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feeling of the same changes as they occur is emotion. So what he is saying is, to cut it, make it simple, the stimulus is the bear. It first produces a response of running, and it is that response in the body which is running creates a feeling of fear. Okay, so the sequence is not stimulus, feeling, and response, but the sequence is stimulus, response, and feeling. Therefore, he is saying emotion is somatic. Emotion is something that is felt all over your body. It is not just something that is happening in your head, right. So therefore, common sense in this, to continue his quotation, James's quotation, right, common sense says, we lose our fortune and are sorry and weep, we meet a bear, are frightened and run, and we are insulted by a rival and are angry and strike, right. But the hypothesis to be defined here says that this order is incorrect. We feel sorry because we cried. Okay, the act of crying is what gives you the feeling of sorrow. So angry because we strike and hit and scream, we feel the emotion of anger, and afraid because we tremble. Okay, so this is so without the bodily states following on the perception, the latter would be purely cognitive in form, pale, colorless, destitute of emotional warmth. So what he is basically emphasizing is the response of the body, the participation of the entire body emotion. Without that kind of a participation, your emotion would be purely mental, intellectual, right. It lacks the color and warmth, right, of a full blown emotional response. So that is a very important emphasis. But there are some issues with that. We will see that in a moment, right. Just to contrast the common sense understanding of emotional response, there is stimulus first, feeling next, and response later. There is a normal sequence that people believe. What James' theory is saying is stimulus first, then response of running or whatever, and then that creates also a bodily response, and bodily response is then fed back to the brain, and that is what creates the feeling in the brain. Okay, so then there is also another researcher, Carl Lange, who also talked about the physiological responses correspond to emotions. Particularly, he emphasized the vasomotor response, that is the response of the heart and the circulatory system to emotions. So these ideas together are called the James Lange theory of emotion. So basically, what the theory says is there is an emotional stimulus like the appearance of the bear, which goes to the brain, which goes to the sensory areas, and they get processed, right. That directly produces an activation of the body, which could be external activation or could be internal, like the pounding of the heart and perspiration and things like that. Then body sends feedback back to the brain, and that is what creates a feeling of emotion. So this is James Lange's theory of emotion. Later on came another theory proposed by Cannon and Bard, So, William Cannon developed the idea of homeostasis, which refers to the idea that certain parameters are maintained at at fairly constant levels in the body. For example, we know that our internal core body temperature is held at 98.4 or 6 degrees Celsius. So, there are active mechanisms which try to maintain the temperature at that level, or your blood pressure is the systole is at 120 and the diastole is at 80, and there are active mechanisms which maintain it that way. So, this is homeostasis. So, Cannon also coined the term fight or flight response to describe sympathetic action. So, in certain, so this is the sympathetic nervous system is actually a part of your autonomic nervous system, which in itself is a part of your peripheral nervous system, because we talked about the central and peripheral nervous system. Actually, we did not spend much time on the peripheral nervous system. So, in peripheral nervous system you have the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system refers to the part of the nervous system which is not in your conscious control, not in your voluntary control. So, here there are again two branches, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. In sympathetic nervous system, right, it produces a whole body response, and this is the kind of response that occurs when you are facing a challenge and you want to either fight the challenge or flight or run away from the challenge, right. It simultaneously produces a lot of responses in different organs in the body. So, for example, a full mass discharge of sympathetic nervous system activation is associated with accelerated higher heart rate, higher force of contraction of the heart, right, perspiration, piloerection, or what you call goosebumps, right, the raising of hair, and so on and so forth. So, all these occur simultaneously, right, by a generalized activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So, what these people are Cannon-Bart's theory is saying is, okay, we agree that there is a physiological response, right, in the body, but that response is not specific, because if you think about it, take an example like a positive emotion like love. Like imagine somebody who is trying to, this young boy is trying to propose to a girl. So, this guy got a whole bouquet of flowers, and he has even written a poem about this girl, and then he is trying to propose to the girl. So, I mean naturally he is not going to just read out the poem in a calm fashion, right, in a stoic fashion. There is going to be some emotion. So, he is going to feel the pounding of the heart, he is going to perspire, his lips are going to dry up, and so on and so forth. But imagine a totally different situation where you are suddenly walking on the road and you suddenly see a snake in front of you, and with its a cobra with its raised hood and so on, right. You freeze in your tracks, right, for a moment, you do not know what to do, and again your heart starts pounding and your lips start drying up and you perspire, and right, all these different changes occur again, right. So, the thing is, what is the difference between a guy who is trying to propose to a girl and a guy who is like facing a harmful snake, right. The bodily response is nearly the same, because in both cases what you have is simply a sympathetic activation. So, the bodily feedback is same, it is non-specific, it is not different for different emotions. Okay. So, then how do you distinguish emotion, how do you feel differently in case of different emotions. So, so this is what Cannon and Bart's theory says. Okay. So, thing is, where is this specificity coming from? Okay. So, the Schachter and Singer wanted to explore that, and their answer to this is the bodily response is definitely non-specific, and that is clear. The specificity comes from the cognitive aspect. So, your high level cognitive and conscious interpretation of your external stimulus, right, that is what gives you specificity. So, to test this, they have done an interesting experiment. In this experiment, there were a bunch of subjects placed in 3 different rooms, right, and they were given an injection of adrenaline. Now, adrenaline is basically a drug which will activate the sympathetic nervous system. Now, we all know that we talk about adrenaline rush, that is when you are very excited, right, your heart is pounding and you are perspiring and you are totally excited. Okay, that is because your sympathetic nervous system is activated. So, they inject this drug to activate your nervous system, so for all these subjects. And in the first room, the subjects were so exposed to pleasant experience. Basically, they have introduced actors in each of these rooms. This actor enacts something, okay, and different things in different rooms. In the first room, the actor enacts something pleasant and funny and kind of entertain the crowd. In the second room, the actor enacts something unpleasant and kind of sad. In the third room, the actor enacts something that is emotionally neutral. So, all 3 of them were given the same injection of adrenaline, same dosage. So, at the end of this experience or exposure, the subjects were interrogated about what they felt. it turns out that the feelings were corresponding to the situation, right. That is, the people who are exposed to the pleasant experience, right, they said I had a good time, I felt very happy and all that. People who are in the second room where the actor did something unpleasant, they said, it was very, felt very bad and I am sad or something like that. The third room where the content of acting was emotionally neutral, people said they did not find anything particularly interesting or emotionally significant. So, although the autonomic reaction or the response is same in all three cases, it is the high level cognitive interpretation, right, that is what is giving specificity. It is not coming from the body, from the physiology. Okay, but still there is a problem, right. If what these people Schachter and Singer showed is that how we interpret emotional responses once they occur, but what they did not explain is why do they occur in the first place. Because you see a stimulus, you see like a bear or a snake or right, somebody doing something pleasant or sort of a girl to whom you want to propose or whatever. Certain stimuli are neutral, they do not produce any. If I look at this, this pen, it does not produce any emotional response in me, right. So, why is there a difference? What is causing this difference? Okay, so none of these previous theories talk about that. They only talk about the bodily response and then something that happens later. So, this questioning has led to the concept of cognitive evaluations, and that gave birth to this whole line of thinking called appraisal theory. The key proponent of appraisal theory was Magda Arnold, right, who actually lived a very long and fruitful life, close to a century. In fact, Magda Arnold has seen the whole evolution of the theory of emotions over a whole century, the ups and downs that occurred in this domain over a whole century. So, her main contention is that emotional feeling depends on cognitive appraisal, right. What you feel depends upon how you interpret the external stimulus, right, cognitively. Okay, that appraisal consists of basically asking and answering this question. So, what I am looking at, what I am facing, is it good for me or bad for me? Okay, that is what is called appraisal. And the key difference in appraisal theory compared to some of the previous theories is that the appraisal, although it depends on cognitive input, the stimulus that you see, and the actual appraisal happens unconsciously. Okay, so, in fact, the unconscious element of emotions is very important, and that is emphasized by further other workers that we encounter later on in this lecture. So, although the starting point is cognitive, right, the appraisal actually the proper is unconscious, and that is why very often it is very hard to express your emotions. You feeling something queasy, something odd, and right, you just say I am in a bad mood, I just want to be alone and things like that. That is because there are a lot of what we call emotional experience is difficult to put in words. There is an unconscious element by its very nature. So, in the appraisal theory, the appraisal part is thought to be occurring unconsciously. Now, it also leads to an action tendency, that is, so unlike say William James, who took a kind of extreme position, right, where he says the action itself gives rise to emotional experience or emotional feeling. In Magda Arnold's theory, there is only action tendency and not explicit action, and that so you want to do something in response to that stimulus because you evaluated the stimulus to be good or bad or whatever, and that action tendency gives rise to a feeling, and that is your emotional feeling. So, others have extended these ideas, and in fact, Richard Lazarus has developed a whole theory of coping, that again in the cornerstone of his theory is that emotion of this theory of emotion is appraisal, and he says that appraisal is automatic and is often unconscious, an assessment of what is happening and what it may mean to them, to the person or those who care about. So, again appraisal has to do with the question of is it good for me or bad for me, or is it good for somebody I care about, or is it bad for them. So, cognitive interpretation of situations, right, influence emotional experience, right. So, for example, in one of the experiments that Richard Lazarus has performed, or the subjects who watch a gruesome film, it is about some kind of a gory ritual that is performed by Australian Aborigines. So, in one case there is also a very solid a very scary soundtrack that goes along with the video, and in other case the soundtrack is very simple and emotionally neutral, and so they actually measure the autonomous response in terms of heart rate and change in blood pressure and things like that. It turns out that the emotional response was much stronger in case of the video, when the video went along with a kind of a strong and a kind of a disturbing soundtrack. So, in this case the autonomic response itself was determined by the sensory stimulus. In this theory of appraisal proposed by Lazarus, that appraisal can become more important than reality, because appraisal is, although it depends upon on the sensory stimulus which comes from the world and therefore objective, the appraisal process itself is unconscious and also it is completely personal, right. Some people can take a very simple thing, evaluate it, right, or appraisal is evaluation, right. So, evaluate it in a very big way. For example, you walk along the corridor and you feel, you see somebody that did not smile at you, just ignored you, and you can make a mountain of that molehill and interpret it in a very negative way. Or somebody has just lost a job and the person could be taking it very coolly, very casually, right. The appraisal is something, so the outward fact is same, right, or that is an objective part of it, but your inner evaluation or appraisal of it could vary a lot from person to person, right. So, when what we call stress is actually something that arises out of appraisal, right, your appraisal or the way you appraise your day to day situations. So, along with Susan Folkman, he has written this book called Stress and Appraisal and Coping. So, how does appraisal lead to stress, or abnormal appraisal can lead to stress, and then how do you cope with it, right, and how do you reduce stress. So, Richard Lazarus gave a classification of appraisals in terms of these are again the same emotions that we have seen before, but his commentary on the emotion in terms of an appraisal is slightly different. So, anger is defined as a demeaning offense against me and mine. Fear is defined as facing an immediate, concrete and overwhelming physical danger. Now, sadness is defined as having experienced a irrevocable loss. Disgust is defined as taking in or being too close to an indigestible object or an idea, metaphorically speaking. And happiness is making reasonable progress towards realization of a goal. So, in all these things, actually in most of these definitions of emotions, right, what you see is something good is happening to me or something bad is happening to me, or something good is likely to happen in future, something bad is likely to happen in future. Okay, it is talking about an actual realized positive or negative for me, or at the prospect of something positive or negative for me in future. So, he is kind of trying to break down the whole gamut of emotions into certain axes. So, we will return to this idea later on towards the end of this lecture, when we try to outline a whole theory of emotions which has certain neurobiological grounding. So, basically if you look at the relation between emotion and appraisal, this emotion stimulus which is sensory stimulus which comes from the world and therefore, that is objective, but the emotion, the stimulus enters your unconscious and that is where appraisal occurs and comes back up as your emotional feeling. Okay. So, that is again your is conscious. Now, this so there are two parts to emotion, there is a conscious part, there is a cognitive part, and there is a unconscious part. But it so happened that as people kept developing and defining the theories of emotion, the conscious and cognitive part started becoming more dominant, right. That is because of the way in which psychology has evolved during the 20th century. In the first half of 20th century, right, we saw what is called the behaviorist revolution, because before that people were talking about when people talked about a person's nature, right, or mind, they would use things like instincts and drives and motivations and so on and so forth. But these are the abstract things, you cannot pinpoint them, you cannot observe them. But science is all about dealing with things that are observable, that are measurable, and that can be expressed in numbers, right. So, how do you quantify and measure something like an instinct, okay, or a drive or motivation? So, there was as a reaction to those kinds of loose terminology that were quite popular earlier in the late 19th century. The 20th century has seen this reaction to that called the behaviorist revolution, where people like Skinner and Watson and a whole lot of behaviorists, they have insisted that you always talk in terms of observables of behavior. So, they do not talk about motivation, they only see okay, the animal has pressed some lever 10 times. So, that is a number and I can measure that, I can observe that. So, and also the part of the reason you need a behaviorist evolution was because we did not know much about inner workings of the brain at that time. So, people had to depend a lot on outward behavior. but things have changed in the second half of 20th century. Particularly what happened in the towards the middle of the 20th century is the computer revolution. So, people have begun to build these large computers, they have used them in the Second World War, and therefore, the computer metaphor became very popular, it became very influential, thinking of the brain, because people also have thought of brain as a big computer. We have seen that in the work of McCullough and Pitts, they thought that brain is a big computer and neurons are like logic gates and so on. So, therefore, so that gave rise to cognitivist revolution in psychology. So, because of which people kept thinking of everything as a result of some kind of a cognition, as some kind of cognitive processing. So, even emotions were dragged into that kind of a attempt, right. So, there was a tendency to reduce emotions to cognitive analysis. So, but that robs emotions of their elusiveness, their mysterious quality and the unpredictability. Okay, so, then the reaction again started to this kind of a attempt to reduce emotions to cognitive processing, and so people began to probe the unconscious roots of emotions. One of the key figures who has emphasized that the emotions are unconscious is Robert J. Zunk. He said that emotional preferences could be formed without any cognitive registration of the stimuli. So, all the other theories that we have seen have said the starting point of emotion is this cognitive interpretation, but appraisal itself happens in the unconscious. But Robert J. Zunk, he emphasized that you can have emotional feeling without any cognitive registration of it. To illustrate this, he studied what is called exposure effect. So, in these kinds of studies, subjects were presented certain sensory patterns, but these patterns were shown for such a short time that it is not enough for those stimuli to enter your conscious experience, right. But still the subjects preferred patterns that they were previously exposed to. So, let us look at an example of exposure effect. So, here in this picture you can see two emoticons, two figures, one is a smiley and other is like a frowny, it shows a frowning face, and these images are shown very briefly for only 5 milliseconds, and that is too brief for a person to consciously realize and have an experience of what they are looking at. So, after that very brief presentation for just 5 milliseconds, right, the images are masked by some kind of a dark rectangular mask, and after that then they show a kind of a neutral picture like a Chinese ideogram, like a Chinese character. So, the assumption here is actually in the experiment none of the experimenters could read Chinese. So, for them a Chinese character is just an emotionally neutral pattern, an abstract pattern. So, after they were exposed to lots of these pairs of emoticons and Chinese patterns, right, then they were shown only the Chinese patterns and asked them which do you like more. Okay, since the patterns are basically neutral, normally you would think that they would not have any particular preference to these patterns, but it turns out that the patterns which were paired with a smiley were preferred more than patterns which were paired with a frowning face. Okay, so that is very interesting, which clearly shows that your emotional experience that you had or emotional bias that you had nothing to do with your cognitive interpretation. So, this gave rise to a whole body of work where people studied the subliminal subconscious components of perception. So, in some studies people were given anesthesia, and the people who were under anesthesia, they were played certain words while they were in anesthetized, right, through some kind of headphones, and once they are back again and in the waking condition, they were given stubs of words. So, for example, and they were asked to complete, for example, during anesthesia they were played this word like cordial, and after they became awake, right, they were given a word like COR, okay, and they asked them, okay, will you fill them as cordial or correct. Okay. So, they chose cordial more often than correct, because that was the word that they have heard while they were anesthetized. So, obviously, while they are anesthetized there is no conscious experience, right, but the words have entered the unconscious, and therefore, that is showing up as a bias to the choice. Okay. So, again there is a interesting book called Hidden Persuaders, which is written by Vance Packard. He has studied or covered the reports of James Vickery, right, who has talked about a lot of these subliminal perceptions or experiments with subliminal perception, where they use this phenomenon for advertising. So, in some of these advertisements they flash a very brief message, very short message only for say 3 milliseconds in the middle of a movie. So, message could go like eat popcorn or drink Coca-Cola, right, and then in the intermission they found that the sales of popcorn went up by 57% or Coke by 18%. Okay, in fact, there is a when the society came to know about this kind of experiments or this kind of advertisements, there is a lot of outrage against this, and because it is like you are influencing minds by playing with their emotions by without their conscious knowledge of that they are being manipulated unconsciously. The other phenomena in neuroscience which also talk about how the unconscious can also give rise to perceptions and feelings and things like that. So, for example, there is this phenomenon called blind sight, which is a kind of a paradoxical sight. So, people so we know that sight requires eyes, you need to have intact eyes to be able to see something, but that is not sufficient, right. You also need to have an intact brain, you need to have your visual maps to have formed correctly, so that you can receive the information coming from your eyes and interpret them and experience these visual experiences, right, in your brain. And a lot of the visual awareness occurs in the visual cortex, right. So, in certain patients who are said to have what is called blind sight, there is a visual cortical damage. So, therefore, they do not have visual experience, there is conscious visual awareness, but very often they can show evidence of being able to produce visually based performance. So, for example, if you take a blind sight subject and if you say, okay, I am throwing a ball at you, can you catch it? Okay, initially the subject might say, oh, no, I cannot see, maybe I will not be able to do it, but if they tried it, they would be able to catch the ball with a very high probability. Okay, so similarly, they can show evidence of visual perception, although they do not have a awareness of visual experience. Okay, this is a paradoxical thing, but it is a fact, it is a fact of neuroscience. So, similarly, there is something called numb sense, so they are numb, there is a damage to the somatosensory cortex, so they cannot feel the touch, but if you let them palpate something simply by feeling it, they may be able to say what it is. Similarly, there is this paradoxical hearing called deaf hearing. So, all these phenomena say that so there is unconscious side to experience, and so for emotions also you need to look at this unconscious side.